our speaker, David Upton, former diplomat and a former management consultant, man of many parts, rather like the man he's going to be talking about tonight. And he's also now, I think, a computational artist, which I have no idea what that is, so maybe you'll tell us about it. But without further ado, please welcome David Upton.
If I was giving a talk on somebody, I would say I'm going to talk about Gordon Pask, the explorer, or the poet, or something like that. But he doesn't fit into any easy generalization. He was a scientist, he was an artist, he was a thinker, he was a biologist, he was a systems analyst, he did all sorts of things, an educationalist and so on and so forth. And I think he's just disappeared off the screen as well, but he did exist. In order to explain anything about him, I'm going to have various digressions into odd aspects of mid-20th century computing and science called cybernetics, which was very popular a few years ago but isn't now. I'll be showing you lots of diagrams and that sort of thing, and there will be a short test afterwards. Anyway, this is Gordon Pask. He was born in 1926 in Derby. His parents were sort of fairly wealthy middle class. His father was apparently a partner in a fruit import company. He had two elder brothers, one of whom was, I think, a Methodist minister. And the other one, was called Edgar, was a doctor. He was known in the family as Gar, but his name was Edgar. He was a doctor and specialized in anesthetics. And he did, during the war, some very cutting-edge research on the survival of unconscious people, unconscious pilots or whatever. If they fell in the water, how were they going to live? How long were they going to live, and what do you have to do? And it was notable for the fact that, as well as doing the research, he volunteered himself as the guinea pig. So to this day, the British Association of Anaesthetics still awards the Pask Award, named after Professor Edgar A. Pask, OBE, awarded to anaesthetists who have demonstrated exceptional bravery in the performance of their clinical duties. So there was poor old Gordon Pask, third son, following an elder brother like that. It's quite difficult. He was an inspiration to him, but also, I think, it's difficult for anybody at that sort of age to work out what you want to do. Gordon took a degree in geology and mining, and then, probably influenced by Gar, went to Cambridge in the early 1950s and studied sciences and physiology. I should say that one of the standard works on cybernetics in the period goes out of its way to say Gordon was the object of an enormous amount of love and affection. Many people cared for him intensely. You don't often find that in biographies. I think it's worth reporting. Clearly a lot of people liked him. Anyway, as well as going to Cambridge to study medicine and physiology or whatever it was, he also joined the Footlights Club at Cambridge. I don't know whether you heard of that, but it's a club for people who want to be comedians and actors and this sort of thing. And John Cleese and Hugh Laurie, for example, both went there. And Gordon Pask signed up as a member, and according to their internet site, he was credited with writing some of the lyrics for their annual review in 1953 and 1954. So this is a man with a... There we go. Yes, I think we go. Yes. But then there came into his life, as he was studying physiology at Cambridge. This man is called Norbert Wiener. He was an American scientist, mathematician, what have you. He's one of those annoying people who did everything at an early age. He was a doctor, a PhD at 19. And he wrote all sorts of books about all sorts of subjects that I don't even start to understand. He was associated with Bertrand Russell. He was associated with the Shannon of information theory. And he came to Cambridge just after Pask had arrived there. He'd been a regular visitor to Cambridge. He knew a lot of people, but he was famously absent-minded. There's a story about when he was lecturing at MIT. He decided to go home one day for lunch. He lived on the campus, a nice little house on the campus. He decided to go home. And when he got there, his house was empty. There were no cars in the drive. When you looked through the windows, there was no furniture inside the house, nothing. So it's just he was about to start panicking, he noticed this little girl standing nearby, and he went over to her and said, "Excuse me, but can you tell me what's happened to the Wiener family?" And the little girl said, "Mummy said you might have forgotten that we're moving today, Daddy. I'll take it." And so I think Cambridge decided that although he knew Cambridge quite well, he probably needed a minder to look after him while he was there. And Pask, for some genius reason, was deputed by his director of studies to be this minder and to go around with Norbert Wiener for however long it was, look after him, make sure he got his lunch, things like that. He won flying bomb and the Spitfire. In the last 2 years of the war, the Nazis fired a lot of V-1 flying bombs at us, and they caused quite a lot of damage and killed quite a lot of people. It was a very limited guided missile. Basically, all it did was fly along a compass line, so you pointed it in the right direction, and it flew ahead, and it had a measured amount of rocket fuel in it, and when that ended, it crashed somewhere in Britain. And that was the best they could do for navigation at that time. But they were a real nuisance to get rid of because they were very fast. There were only a few British fighter aircraft that could catch them. When you caught them, you had to get quite close into them to blow them up. But the trouble was, if you were close to them when they blew up, they were close to you as well, and aircraft could get damaged by the explosion right in front of them. So they tried this fascinating technique of trying to actually tip them over, so you put your wing underneath them and you sort of flip like this, and the flying bomb would be flipped off its course. The trouble with that was, though, that you were only taking a device which was liable to hit Britain somewhere at random and turning it into a device which was liable to hit Britain somewhere else at random, which is limited use. So they came to the conclusion that what they really needed was a gun aiming system, something that would enable you to fire an anti-aircraft gun from the ground and shoot this thing down without having all the mess of involving a fighter aircraft and not being sure where it would explode and things like that. And Wiener was the sort of man who, was right for the complex mathematics and the serious thought involved in writing. I don't know how well it worked, but they produced an anti-aircraft predictor which modeled the behavior of the aircraft and also the other factors that might be involved, and which, I think, enabled the rate of shooting these things down by ground-based artillery to go up quite appreciably. So this was quite a famous guy. But whilst he was doing this, he got interested in a subject called cybernetics, which I will explain in a moment. Cybernetics was a science that was starting off in the late 40s, early 50s. Largely popularized by Wiener, who wrote a book about it. Then became very popular in the 50s and 60s. Indeed, Brunel University, which is just up the road somewhere, had a professor of cybernetics. It doesn't now. The professor of cybernetics, for part of the time at least, was actually Gordon Pask, but nonetheless. Whereas you'd find it difficult to find a cybernetics department in a university these days. It's almost forgotten as an academic subject. There are two societies, a British Cybernetics Society and an American Cybernetics Society, which still exist to promote it, but I hope it's not an unkind thing to say, they're a little bit outside the mainstream. Cybernetics is the study of what's been defined as the study of circular causal and feedback mechanisms in biological and social systems, or as a transdiscipline that investigates how to construct complex systems, brains, organisms, societies, and machines, and measure how they adapt to emergent changes in the environment. Putting it more, the simplest example, the simplest and the obvious early example is a thermostat. You've all left your heating on, I hope, and when you get back home, your house will be just right, the right temperature, because you have a sensor in the cybernetic feedback loop, which finds out monitors what the temperature is. If the temperature goes below a certain point, it turns your heating on. If the temperature goes above a certain point, it turns your heating off. And this is in effect a very simple cybernetic loop, using one thing to control another, the state of one thing to control another. cybernetics experimenters realized that if you applied cybernetics sort of twice, so if you had not only cybernetics to how your sensor was working, but also to what you set it at and this sort of thing, you could come up with some very complex models of activity which could almost seem to simulate human activity, could almost be realistic. In the course of all of this, anyway, Pask realized that what he really wanted to study was cybernetics. So he did. I just want to do another brief digression. I'm sorry about this, but about computers at the time, some of the problems with computers at the time. As you know, there are two sorts of computers. There are digital computers, which is what you and I mean by a computer. And there are also analog computers, which are a different way of doing it, which were very much simpler, well, probably simpler. Were used quite a lot in the early days, but haven't been used very much since. You can still buy an analog computer on Amazon, but only one as far as I can see. Pask's early machines were analog machines. You built it yourself. You typically, you know, if you wanted to add two voltages, instead of adding two numbers, you put both voltages on the same wire, and then there was twice as much voltage on it, that sort of thing. It was a physical analog rather than having a digital simulation, which is what digital computers do. But computers, you know, in the 50s and 60s were very short, very, very difficult to get hold of. They were still just past the age when they were desperately secret. When they were desperately secret, and they were enormously expensive, and only 6 people in the country knew how to work them and that sort of thing. So you had to borrow computer time. And one of Pask's colleagues told me that they used to rent space on a mainframe at Southampton University. When they wanted to test one of their programs, they'd drive down at night to use the machine in the small hours. It's before the motorway down to Southampton, so it took about 2 hours to get there. When you got there, you'd feed in your punch cards or your computer tape. And if you made a mistake, it just stopped, and you had to come back next week and do it all over again. Not like today, where you can alter things, you can debug your code online and things like that. So it was a very difficult and very time-consuming business. However, the good news is that people started building better computers. These, the 3 on the left, are what are called PDP-8s. Oops, there we are. As you can see, they are referred to at the time as microcomputers, which give the size of a large fridge freezer, as you can see. But that, in those days, that was small. In the days when a computer needed a room this size and air conditioning and all sorts of things. But it was still very limited. It was quite primitive in the way you programmed it, and in the operating system and in the external things. You know, for instance, we take it for granted that if you want to draw a red circle on your computer screen, you can do that, and you can print it out, and you can see your red circle. But in those days, computers, where they had screens at all, just showed you lines of green text on black background. If you wanted to draw something, you had to write your own hardware to do it, and then write your own software to drive it. It was a very difficult business and a lot of hard work for the people involved in it. Things started to improve. In 1969, when Apollo 11 went to the moon with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, not only got them there, more importantly, got them back as well. That had an Apollo guidance computer, specially designed by MIT, which was the first portable, self-contained digital computer. It weighed 70 pounds, but it was portable, it was self-contained. And it was also the first computer to use integrated circuits, what we'd call chips today. These computers navigated and managed the flights for all of the Apollo crews on missions to the moon in the late 1960s and early 1970s. So suddenly, computers as we know them were starting to appear in a reasonable sense. But the moon program used 50% of the United States' entire production of the newly developed chips to build the computers for their missions. It just goes to show how things have changed. The enormous amount of chips that they're using at the moment are very sophisticated chips. And then the other great thing about this computer was that one of these things was one of the first computers to cost you less than $20,000. And that, given change in prices, the value of money, was probably nearer to 200,000 in our terms. But then along came another one which got small. You know the story, Moore's Law, it gets smaller and more powerful and cheaper. Along came another one which cost $1,500, and so on and so forth. And that meant that gradually these things were getting within the reach of people who wanted to do research into all sorts of things. Whether they were building systems or whatever, suddenly you could do things on a computer, you could have time, you could work on them properly, you could get to know them. And Pask was an early user of computers, as you might imagine. He set up a company called Systems Research, which I'll come to in a moment. And he then, one of his first projects, let's just go that way, which he built on his bedroom table in Cambridge over several years, was called Musicolor. Musicolor was a device which added color to music. A human musician played something. The machine listened, and responding to the music, it illuminated or flickered or whatever banks of colored lights, so that it was playing a kind of symphony in color as the musician was playing the music. But it was designed so that it got bored if the musician repeated himself too often. Now imagine the significance of this. Pask has invented a machine that could get bored. And it sounds funny in a way, but it's considered as a machine repeating human tendencies. Being bored is quite a complex thing to do. I mean, it depends partly on what's happening outside yourself. You might be listening to a very dull lecture on computers and get thoroughly bored with that sort of thing. But you can also get bored. Some people get bored more often than others. Some people take a lively interest in things, and others are just quite happy to sit around like vegetables and get bored all the time. And then also it can depend on, if you've just had a large lunch and you want to go to sleep, you probably get bored much faster than if you haven't. So being bored is a very complex state. And getting a machine to model that is quite an achievement. You might say why, I'll come to that in a moment. But getting a machine to model that is a sort of thing Pask did. He had that sort of inquiring mind that asked, how can we model this? Is this something that's relevant? And the advantage in this particular Musicolor thing was that the human and the machine played a duet, and the human played the music and the machine showed the lights. In a sense, what musicians call jamming, I believe. They're playing together and bouncing off ideas off each other and this sort of thing. And the result was that quite often people who'd played this thing thought that they'd been on it for about 20 minutes or something. And it turned out they'd been playing for 2 hours or 3 hours because they were so enthralled. And they were getting all sorts of new ideas and producing all sorts of hopefully nice music. As a practical thing, well, it worked. It was not a great success. It wasn't very reliable, and it wasn't easily scalable. He used it in some small nightclubs run by his friends, and they, give the occasional performance. My admiration for him went up dramatically when I discovered he actually demonstrated it to Billy Butlin. Billy Butlin was just setting up his holiday camp chain. He was a very important businessman. He was wealthy, he had a lot of money, a lot of people knew he was buying things, so he was constantly getting pestered by people trying to sell him something. And he was renowned as a sort of hard-nosed chap who, come up from the factory floor or fairground floor or whatever it was and didn't suffer fools gladly. Despite this, he let in these 2 young men from Cambridge to come and tell him about the machine which flashed lights. The story goes, it gets even worse. The story goes that he agreed that they could give him a demonstration. So they went along and they built this thing, put this thing up on his desk, this great big heavy thing, put it on his desk, turned it on, and it exploded. I mean, Pask's life is sort of strewn with things like that. But they turned it off and turned it on again, and when they turned it on again, it worked. And Butlin was so impressed that after having so comprehensively exploded that it worked, I'd like to say he took it on. I don't think he did. He listened to the rest of the demonstration and said some nice words probably, but it's a good job actually, because although it might have worked once. The thought of it, working in a large hall in Butlins for 3 sessions a day for 6 months or something, it just doesn't bear thinking about. But anyway, it was one of his first successes. His first commercially viable project was a thing called the Saki for self-adapted keyboard trainee, which was a machine to train people to use things like keyboards and all sorts of things like that. And what this did was it had a feedback loop. It didn't just say, okay, type this. It looked to see what you'd done. And it saw which letters you got right and which letters you got wrong. And you got more practice of the ones you got wrong, and less practice and less time for the ones you got right. And the theory being that when you'd finished, you'd be equally good as all of them. Now, oddly enough, they only sold about 50 licenses through another company. But it did start to take off. It was probably their first commercial success. Oddly enough, there's a package still available on Amazon called Mavis Beacon Teaches Typing, which some authors say is actually derived ultimately from Pask's Saki. I mean, it's not the same code, obviously, but the idea of how it worked, it probably is. He also worked on design of teaching systems of all sorts. This was the early days of the Open University, so there was a lot of interest in new ways of teaching people, particularly at university level. He became a visiting professor at the Open University and got another doctorate from them. He collected doctorates, a fascinating man. So eventually he decided that he was going to open his own business, and he set up an office in Richmond Hill.
Gordon Pask is Professor of Educational Technology at the Open University, of Cybernetics at Brunel, and President of the Society for General Systems Research, the international society in his field. Otherwise, he spends his time with his research company in Richmond, Surrey. In this program, we look at some of the ideas and experiments which he and his team are creating based on his theory of how we learn. Excited.
There he is wiring up an analog computer, effectively, I think. The building he used was 19 to 20 Hill Rise. It's an office block with, it had a shop or whatever at the bottom. I've tried to, I know which one it is because it's numbered, but assuming they haven't changed the numbers, it's quite difficult to be sure, because all the facades on Richmond Hill appear to have changed. The slope looks about right, but that's about the only thing that actually looks right. I can't identify any buildings that it could have been. It used to be over a record shop, which Simon remembers, but it's been over all sorts of things ever since. From this building, he set about with remarkable success in attracting some prestigious customers. He got the US Army, for instance, he got the British Police, the Home Office, and I think British Armed Forces to do some training stuff with him. And what he was doing, in effect, as far as I can see, were what tends to be called serious games. This is one from the reports of one of his games, which was designed for the US Army and was called the Team Decision System. This was in the late 70s. This is a photograph from the official report. Sorry. This is one of the consoles that you had in front of you. When you sat down to play this game, you see you and your team were sitting in front of some big consoles with all these buttons, and these represented various things you could do, and you had to work through how you would respond to a scenario. The scenario was something to do with space travel, which May sound a bit futuristic, but don't forget this was only a few years after they actually had gone to the moon using computers, so I suppose he felt it was quite appropriate. There will be a short test on this, by the way. But he was building these sorts of very complex systems and running experiments on them for the US Army and writing reports, which are, again, are available on the internet. I'm not sure I entirely understand them, to be fair. You can see this one has 4 microprocessors, what we would today call a laptop computer or something similar to that, and various displays. And it has 4, I think it's 4 stations, workstations. And the idea is you're faced with a scenario and you have to take decisions. And what he's interested in looking at is the way the decision flows, people, you know, who does what and in what order and that sort of thing. And it's not about the scenarios. The scenarios are just an abstract thing. They're supposed to get you thinking, do something you can think about. Story goes, I was told by somebody who actually worked with him on this, that they had one training system which they did for the Home Office, which involved training the police on decision-making in the case of major crime and criminal incidents. And they were setting up a scenario involving an armed raid of some significance at Heathrow. And they are, you know, getting really excited by this and how what the robbers would do and how they would respond to this sort of thing. They forgot to keep their voices down. They forgot that they were in a shared building. And somebody in the shop downstairs, whatever it was, reported them to the real Richmond police, who turned up and raided systems research. I wish I'd been a fly on the wall. That would have been interesting. What he was really interested in a sense, or one of his major interests anyway, was learning to learn.
Got a duty as educators to instill the basic skills of reading, writing, arithmetic, communication, driving motor cars, working with numbers, knowing about our history, our culture, everything. But also, we have a duty which I think isn't forgotten, but is overlaid perhaps by the plethora of other things which have to be done, of teaching another skill, perhaps you'd rather call it an art, that of learning to learn.
By now, he'd moved into Montague Road. The house that he lived in, I think, has been knocked down. I think it's a small block of flats now. And he met a chap called Paul Pangaro, who was an American postgraduate who came over to study at the feet of Pask, so to speak. And Pangaro said, I focused on hanging around Pask as much as possible. In time, his wife Elizabeth agreed to rent a room to me in the family home on Montague Road on Richmond Hill, a short walk from the office. This was an impressive semi-detached Edwardian townhouse, 3 floors for living above ground, and 1 for a laboratory below. I was happy to pay Elizabeth for lodging instead of local hotels. Proximity made it easy for me to help Gordon get up for dinner guests. He preferred to sleep in the day and work all night. This afforded ready access to the laboratory in the basement and to the professor in his study for late-night conversations about conversation theory. You notice this refers to his eccentric hours, and he was a very self-conscious eccentric. He believed that he worked best at 3 o'clock in the morning, so his ideal was to sleep during the day and work at night. And this is fine, probably, unless you are also running a small business and a professor, when people are going to expect you to go for business meetings at an hour that they regard as civilized. And similarly, professors have to go to academic meetings and teach their students and this sort of thing. And he tried to square the circle. He had an enormous amount of energy. And he tried to square the circle, and I think the only way he did it was by taking drugs. I mean, in the 60s and 70s, we didn't know the problems then. We didn't realize what could happen. And he, I think, took uppers when he wanted to wake up and downers when he wanted to sleep. Or I'm not sure of the vocabulary. I'm a drug addict myself, so I don't really know. But he was renowned for the fact his briefcase always rattled when you shook it because of the pill bottles. And Pangaro says, it's rather moving actually, from the intensity with which he lived, perhaps his own body suffered the most. waking him for his evening dinner guests after his long nights of work and short days of sleep entailed a delicate balance of firmness and compassion. While waiting, I could review the fruits of his night's work, perhaps a new song lyric or research paper. Before the jacket and bow tie and cape could go on, here was this mad and brilliant creature, all sinew, rising to dazzle and demand of us and of himself once more. He also dressed very much like an Edwardian dandy. He liked to wear a bow tie, he liked to wear a double-breasted suit, jacket, and he apparently liked to wear a cape sometimes. You know, if you'd found him in a Hammer horror film, you wouldn't have been surprised. But the other thing, which I don't think this is true because the timing doesn't quite work, it has been suggested that the first Doctor Who was modelled on Gordon Pask because he had been on BBC, as we've seen. Anyway, there were one or two other things that are worth mentioning he was doing. I won't dwell on these too much. One was that he wanted to build a chemical computer. There's a diagram of it. The way this worked was that if you 300. If you put put electrodes into alcohol solutions of tin and silver, tendrils grow from one to the other. I mean, this has been known for some time. You know, it's the principle of electroplating and all that sort of thing. I don't quite understand how it works, but it does. And his insight was to see that you could, in effect, you could grow almost ganglia or neurons or whatever you call them in the way that the brain does, simply by putting a current through things. And what he also managed to do was to put sensors into each of these so you could see what was going along the connection. And what his innovation was to feed certain connections and not others. Apparently, if you put ions into them, I don't know what that means actually, but if you put certain types of chemicals into them, they grew better. And he tried developing sensors, so he would ring a buzzer, test each one of these things to see which ones were reflecting it, and feed those, and not the others. So his idea was that eventually he could grow a complete circuit, a complete sensor, of something that had never existed before. By a sort of reward system. And the word I think that I like that he came up with is underspecified. You know, you can, if you want to build a system, specify exactly what you want, what it's going to do, and all that sort of thing. But then the trouble is, that's all it will do. It will never surprise you. Whereas if you allow the system to build something, to build itself, in effect, developing and following these logical ways by the cybernetic system, in effect, of taking a feedback loop from the system as you build it and then feeding back into itself, you can grow something which is better and, or different anyway. It may not be better, but it's different. And he was, that sort of thing, and I don't think he ever made much of that. I mean, they did it on an experimental basis, but I don't think chemical computers ever really took over or ever will, but you never know. He was also very interested in architecture. He had a lot to do with the Architectural Association. He lectured to them quite a lot. And you can imagine the ideas of cybernetics in a building and how you could use it to control the building. This was an age when people were building buildings that changed their shape, even depending on what you wanted to do with them. That didn't catch on, it was a bit expensive, but you could follow people around the house and you could do things in the way that they liked. You could have feedback loops so that it got to the right temperature or something like that. But as another writer said, the key to Pask's innovative, underspecified systems is that input criteria are determined dynamically, sometimes like musicolor by adjusting the weighting of particular input criteria, varying how important they are in the overall calculations, and sometimes, like the chemical computer, by enabling the system to select or construct its own input criteria. In other words, it's doing something through all these cybernetic loops that you don't understand, that you wouldn't have thought of if you designed the system, but which it thinks of, unquote, quote unquote, thinks of in this sort of experiential way. When Pask built his machines and his theory, his philosophical view was at odds with artificial intelligence, which arose from the seeds of cybernetics, but presumes that knowledge is a commodity to pluck from the environment and stick in a cubbyhole. Pask's learning environment, whether for entertainment or touch typing or statistics, viewed the human as part of a resonance that looped from the human through the environment or apparatus, back through the human and around again. For Pask, that is the interaction by which we understand each other when we speak or dance together. These people tend to see the whole of life as a series of intersecting loops, whereas what he's saying is that the other artificial intelligence way is more about establishing facts that aren't necessarily looping or changing. They're just, it's an interesting distinction. They make quite a lot of it. I'm not sure it's really all that useful, but sometimes I think it can be. I should say, by the way, that Pask's obituary says, Pask was known for the intensity and scope of his lectures. Audience comprehension was more elusive. I often heard listeners say that 10% of his talk was understandable, and if the other 90% was as good, then this guy was really something. And he does. It's extraordinary. He does have that. I mean, I regard myself as a friend of Pask, and I've tried to read a lot of his stuff. Not very hard, but he isn't the clearest of writers or speakers. Sometimes it's difficult to follow exactly what he means. Largely, I think, because his mind is so far out ahead of mine that I'm racing to catch it up. Anyway, as you were kind enough to mention, I aspire to be a computational artist, and arts are something that I'm particularly interested in. So I'm going to end on one of his things, which was specifically designs and artwork. In 1968, the Institute for Contemporary Arts in London held an exhibition called Cybernetic Serendipity, which became really one of the exhibitions of its time, based entirely around art done by computers, if you'd like to put it that way. They had computers writing poems, they had computers writing and playing music, they had computers drawing pictures, they had all sorts of things. And Pask was asked to contribute something to this. So this is his account of what he contributed.
Not restricted by any means to use in the classroom or several places like that. That is a machinery, hardly discernible perhaps, for running a colloquy of mobiles, it was called. That's the wrong way up here. These were large suspended mobiles, and I was taxed with the ability of making an exhibition piece. For entertainment, in fact, which people would engage in conversations through. So I made a family of mobiles, which were these things on a mechanically rotatable beams, an environment out of a PDP-8 computer, small one, and what in those days would be equivalent to a microprocessor and a load of junk in each one. Point being that the mobiles had a little life of their own. They chatted to each other by beams of light, which they waggled up and down, and by printed sound and so forth, and anybody could go into that discourse if they wanted to, and hoot at them or put their hand up in front of the light. And they did.
By mobiles, he means, those things you hang over child's prams. They're just little things on a piece of wire, and they move with the wind and that sort of thing. He meant that sort of thing. And his colloquy of mobiles was a group of mobiles talking to each other, in effect. I'll show you. It was built in 1968, and I'm sure it fell apart in 1969. But just to give you some idea, Paul Pangaro, the American chap who lived with him, subsequently got this rebuilt, because he got his students to rebuild it. And the colloquy of mobiles can now be seen in various places. Here, this is what it looked like. This is exactly what it looked like. This was an extraordinary achievement for its time. I'll just read you, if I may, a section from the Cybernetic Serendipity catalogue. To give significance to the communication between the machines, Pask designed the colloquy of mobiles as a social system. At the same time, the form of communication that he conceived referred unmistakably to a sexual analogy. Hung from the ceiling were 2 males and 3 females. After a phase of inactivity, the females, made of fiberglass, they're the big pink things, began to glow more intensely, and the 3 males emitted a ray of light. When the ray of light struck the mirror inside the female mobile structure, by way of rotating the mirror, she tried deflecting the ray back at the free-hanging light sensors above and below the male's aluminium body. The goal of communicating was to achieve this moment of satisfaction, and the mobiles learned to optimize their behavior to the point where this state could be reached with the least possible use of energy. With the help of flashlights and mirrors, the exhibition visitors could also assume the roles of the mobiles and influence the learning process. I don't know to what extent that really worked, that they optimized their behavior to the extent they could do it with the most efficiency. That would be the sort of thing that would interest a modern scientist. But to me, it's fascinating how he built this replica social system with its own set of rules entirely, and was getting the sort of humanish behavior. If I may just show you that again. See, these are the males, which are emitting lights and have mirrors on them. These are the females. And when they strike each other, they respond to each other. And you can see sometimes they get really quite excited. You might say, what is the point of all this? But don't forget, this was the age of conceptual art, when really art was mostly about what art was about. This lady's having an orgasm, I think. And you can see, you could walk in and interrupt it if you wanted to get in the way and things like that. I'm not sure whether many people did. I don't think I'd be brave enough. Anyway, I think I'll stop talking about Pask's career and his development and that sort of thing there, because although he did lots of things, we could go on all night. After a while, systems research got fewer contracts. He became ill. But he got a Doctor of Science from Downing College, Cambridge, a year before he died in 1996. His archives were, there were 2 archives, there's one in Amsterdam and one in the States, or Vienna rather. There's a rather poignant piece by Pangaro, which I'll read to you. I should thank Paul Pangaro, by the way. He's been extremely helpful while writing this. As research contracts dried up for system research in England, the large house on Montague Road had to be let go. The basement laboratory, full of damp equipment, endless wiring, and detritus from decays of building experimental machinery, needed to be dismantled. A giant skip was rented to accept what could not be saved, and it occupied the entire front driveway. Some decisions about what to keep and what to toss were easy. There were old newspapers and electrical parts that would just be thrown in the skip. Then there was Stat Lab, a series of tilted panels with switches and pluggable sockets where a student configured a statistics experiment under the guidance of the CAS training system. There was also a panel from Charlie Gas, a kiosk interface at the public exhibition by the UK Gas Board. It asked a few questions and used the consumer's answers to decide if she was a good candidate for installing gas heat. It was simply a mechanized salesperson. These parts of Stat Lab and Charlie Gas clearly had to be kept. Equipment such as the TDS, the Team Development System, which you remember is the one we saw photographs and plans of earlier, funded by the Army Research Institute and comprising multiple displays, processors and input panels, was to have a new home in the Architectural Association in London, where Gordon would again lecture for a number of years. I certainly would never work again, but it did, apparently, with the able assistance of a long-term colleague. Gordon and I spent all of a night dismantling TDS, and I kept one of the panels with label lights for the archive. It was to be remade for the next installation. As we struggled to untangle, unwire, and pack up the equipment, Gordon spoke of the topology of strings and knots, and explained why, of course, they took so long to detangle. There must have been hundreds of feet of cables. The light was glaring and the air was dank. What might have been a tedious task was made bittersweet by context. A master and one of his many pupils, a little sad together, cleaning out a lab with much history. And Pangara's obituary ends by saying, in his lifetime, he received substantial recognition. Among cyberneticians, he is acknowledged as one of the all-time greats. Conversation theory has provided cybernetics its prospective power for modeling learning and agreement. His students and collaborators were vastly changed by knowing him. Some needed time to recover. I just want, as a sort of coda, just to say that there's a little mystery about cybernetics. If you look at publications, if you buy second-hand books on artificial intelligence, as I'm afraid to say I do sometimes, if you look at essays written, books of essays written before about 1975 or something, I'm not sure of the exact date, it's all about cybernetics. If you look shortly after that, cybernetics hardly gets a mention. It disappears with a thoroughness and a speed which I can only compare to some of the more unfortunate disappearances recently of people like Jimmy Savile and Rolf Harris from the public eye. You know, 1 minute they're there, next minute they're not. It's almost the same with cybernetics. I'm not suggesting there was any impropriety or anything like that. I've asked many people why they think. Some have said to me that it's because cybernetics had a military background, you know, Wiener and his predictor and something like that. But I don't think that's true, because so does every other sort of artificial intelligence. Another suggestion is that machine learning is just so easy and it's taken over. You know, if you haven't used ChatGPT, please do, because it is so easy and so profound to use. Another one is that because it just never fitted into a category, you know. It was difficult to have a chair of cybernetics because there were so many people who might hold it, and all of them would have deficiencies in one area or another because cybernetics is such a big subject. The fourth one, which is my personal view, is it never actually went away. You know, we're still using things like Mavis Beacon, which are incorporating some of Pask's strategies, although not his code. And I was thinking, at the end of the day, I was ordering my groceries from Tesco, and when I put my card in, you know, put in my card details, there's a cybernetic loop because the bank immediately goes and checks with its fraud detection software, which knows all about me and knows what I you know, what I buy and when and this sort of thing, and says, "Oh, it's okay, you pay that one." So I get to eat over the weekend. And if that isn't a cybernetic loop, I'm not sure what is. Anyway, that's my theory about why cybernetics is still around, even though we don't open it. It does mean that it's difficult to talk about Gordon Pask, because not many people realize what cybernetics is, and they probably don't need to. But I am left with the impression that this man was, first of all, was an eminent figure in his field, did some amazing research and some really novel ideas, and the power of his ideas is quite amazing sometimes. And secondly, that he was a genuine character, an eccentric, who I think enriched the life of Richmond for a few years. I'm only sorry I never met him. Thank you very much.
How fascinating, David. That's really recovering a person that I certainly hadn't heard of, but also the whole history of cybernetics.
Yes, yes.
I'm interested in artificial intelligence without any scientific background myself, but you're around for some questions.
I am, yes, indeed.
So, Robert, and we've got a roving mic.
Thank you, David. What brought Gordon to, how long did he live here?
I'm not quite sure why he came here, but I think his daughter, one of his daughters is in the audience, so she may be able to tell us.
Ah.
Yes.
All I know is that from when I came into being, He started off in Rosemont Road. So he
Right.
lived in Rosemont Road.
Yeah.
And then it would have been in 1968, I think. We moved to 16 Montague Road.
Yes.
And then we didn't leave Montague Road till, gosh, what was it, 1167, 78. And we moved to Kings Road, Richmond.
Right.
But systems research is the building on the corner.
Yes.
Where the church, there's a little skinny little road with a church down there. I can't remember what that road is. Is it Vineyard?
Vineyard.
Yes.
Part of the Vineyard,
Yes.
yeah. And then systems research moved from there to the bottom of, gosh, you know when you come down from Richmond Hill, I haven't lived in Richmond for a long time now, and you turn left, and there was a very strange white building with a big archway.
Yes.
And systems research was in there for a long time.
Right.
Why they came to Richmond, I don't know. Because they had been in Liverpool. He met my mother in Liverpool.
Yeah.
But he was a professor at Brunel, so would he have come for that reason?
Yeah, so I can't... he had lots of friends. He had a Professor John Brickell, who was a close friend, and I don't know why he came to Richmond, but yeah, we stayed in Richmond till eventually in about 1980s. The sort of family started off with just about enough money. As you said, it got sunk into the basement, which was floor to ceiling, computers, men with big beards drinking cheap coffee and smoking rollies. That was my memory. And then, yes, we just sort of moved down the hill and then eventually ended up in Clapham, which was fine. And he was very good friends with Red Ken. Anyone remembers Red Ken?
Oh, yes.
Yes, they were buddies. Anyway, I'll pass this.
Oh, fantastic, thank you. Who would like to ask another question? Oh, Judy at the back.
A comment from somebody online who says early computers were slower during the day as there were more users, so the nerds worked at night.
Yes. There's always been a mysterious link between computer programming and staying up late and drinking large amounts of coffee. I assume this grows from this.
Do any of the sort of modern, the Bill Gates, obviously Steve Jobs when he was around and others, did they ever look to, they talk of Turing a lot. I wondered, would they have talked of Pask at all? Would he have come into their...
Probably not, because he was, well, either he may have done, I don't know, but I mean, his initial work was done on analog computers. You know when you see him soldering all those wires together, that's an analog computer, and you build it with wires rather than with logic.
Yes.
And I suspect he was more on that side of things. He didn't make innovations in digital computers. So as far as I know, they didn't.
Right, yes. Any other questions? Oh, yes, Rose in the corner. Sorry, Rose.
I wondered if it's possible to explain in very, very basic terms how he programmed a computer to be bored. Do you say at random repetitions of XX? How stop doing it? I mean,
I don't know how exactly he did it. I've never managed to find a circuit diagram for that. I'm not sure I'd understand it if I did. But I suspect it had something to do with decay of charges on capacitors.
oh dear, I don't understand.
You know, a capacitor is an electric or electronic device that holds a charge, and gradually it decays. And I suspect it was something like that they charged the capacitor when something happened, and gradually it decayed. When it decayed, the thing said, I'm bored now. But I don't honestly know. I mean, he thought, somebody says somewhere, in something I was reading about him, that he had this extraordinary ability to conceptualize experiments. You know, anybody else would just not be able to work out how to do this, but Pask would just sit down and think of a way of doing it that would work. Maybe not brilliantly, but it would work. And I think this is one of those.
I think we might retire now to the downstairs. Are you going to be around at all to ask?
Yes, if I may, yes.
People might want to come up and chat to you afterwards. So, I think... hold on. As a token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
There's a...
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.